Good afternoon. My name is Willow Andreasson. I've been reading chapters from my book, A Journey into the Mysteries of Life, Lessons from the World Beyond, book 1, The End to the Beginning, and posting them up on YouTube. The book is available on www.lulu.com, and the chapter I will be reading today is chapter 2. It's about my grandfather, and it's called My Grandfather, The End of His Beginning. Now, I hope to be able to read the entire chapter, but it may be abridged for timekeeping purposes. Chapter 2. It is safe to say that, along with my sister, my grandfather has been one of the two pivotal influences in my life, and our relationships have continued well beyond the moments of their passing. I am deeply humbled and gratefully honoured to have been blessed with the good fortune of knowing them and spending a quarter of my physical life with them. As I write this book, I keenly feel their presence, knowing that they have wanted me to sit down and write this for a very long time. My grandfather was, as described on one of the many cards laid on the many bouquets atop his coffin on that cold, rainy January day in 1996, an angel. I was the author of the card, endowed with the honest feeling that heaven must have been missing an angel, given that they called Grandfather back to source on Boxing Day. Grandfather had been diagnosed with terminal cancer only 4 days before his passing. My great-uncle, Grandfather's brother, commented at his funeral, "He always did things in a hurry." That particular attribute, it would seem, was attached to my grandfather throughout his life. Grandfather was born in the West Country in the early 1920s. My great-grandmother went into labour a couple of weeks earlier than expected. She thought she had a little while to gather herself before the birth. It turned out that Grandfather had other ideas, however. If I remember family folklore correctly, Great-Granny delivered Grandfather herself on the marital bed. When talking about his birth with Mum, Great-Granny had remarked that Grandfather had always seemed to be in a hurry. Interesting, and yet fitting, that my great-uncle had voiced that once more at the end of Grandfather's earthly life. A good example of coming full circle, if ever such an example were needed. Grandfather's family moved to the rural southeast when he was only a toddler. He grew up on a chicken farm with his brothers and his parents. He was a mischievously charming imp, yet he was also a loving, caring soul. He only ever wanted to help others, never expecting thanks or gifts in return. He possessed a unique gift of being able to communicate with animals, and that affinity with all animals was deeply moving. I have never met anyone who was able to relate to animals in the way Grandfather was able to relate to them. I have fond recollections of Grandfather's childhood reminiscences, growing up in beautiful yet remote countryside not too far from the southeast coast. He did attend church regularly as a child, although I understand that this was due to social expectation as opposed to reasons religious. I got the impression he enjoyed the social side of church life more than any spiritual aspect. He always behaved respectfully in a church, although tried to avoid them later in his life. Only really established the true reasons for this motivation in later years, and it was nothing to do with religious stances or belief. I'm not sure of the exact reasons, but hazard a guess that the family's relocation to an urban area of Surrey during the 1930s was driven by the family's need for work. Although Grandfather became very fond of his adopted home, remaining there for the remainder of his life, he dearly missed the beauty of his childhood countryside. Post-relocation, and long before he was able to drive, Grandfather used to cycle down to the coast most weekends. Passing his driving test in his 40s enabled Grandfather to reconnect with his roots frequently. Grandfather was approaching his 18th birthday when World War II loomed large over the whole country. Grandfather was unable to serve militarily due to nerve problems, but he certainly served his country with the Home Guard. He was also a very accomplished amateur boxer. A potential future career in the field, however, came to a premature end in 1941. He was fighting with a cold and wasn't able to breathe through his nose. Of course, breathing through his mouth left his jaw highly vulnerable to any uppercuts and, predictably, Grandfather's lower jaw was shattered. As mentioned in the first chapter, Grandfather's oldest brother, who was stationed in Naples after its liberation in 1943, met Nana's sister. Nana's sister married Grandfather's brother. Nana followed her sister over to England in December 1947, met Grandfather, and they married in March 1948. Grandfather worked as a postman for the post office for many, many years and was highly regarded by all of his colleagues. He seldom offended anyone and was blessed with the most wonderful sense of fun. He had a natural sense of comic timing. My mother considered herself truly blessed to have such a wonderful man as her father. There was never a more devoted grandfather. He didn't demand respect, but a person instinctively knew that there was an invisible line that wasn't to be crossed. He was always fair, and certainly didn't shy away from pointing out life's injustices to his grandchildren from a very young age. Not so well known about Grandfather was the fact that he had experienced many paranormal anomalies throughout his life. I always believed he had clairaudient abilities in life. During our conversations in the early months of 2011, Grandfather confirmed my suspicions that he had been clairaudient. He admitted he kept this ability very much to himself during his life. What must be remembered is that if someone admitted to hearing voices back in the 1920s, 1930s, that person would, without fail, have been committed to a lifetime in an asylum. One can understand Grandfather's reticence on the matter. He was, however, able to discuss his experiences with his parents. As a child, he told his mother that an uncle of his had passed away. Great-Granny laughed, as last she knew, this uncle was still very much alive. Only hours after Grandfather's declaration, the family received a telegram notifying them of the sad news that this particular uncle had, indeed, passed away. Grandfather strenuously avoided cemeteries and graveyards. When once asked if he would take a shortcut through a graveyard in order to get home quicker, he shuddered that he wouldn't, even if it meant adding over an hour to his journey. During a visit to a church in Naples with Nana, Grandfather sped out, terrified. Mum remembered that Grandfather was pale and trembling. Once he had gathered himself, he declared outright to Mum that he never wanted to enter the building again. It was evident that he had seen something particularly unpleasant, yet he wasn't going to elaborate on what he had spiritually witnessed at that time. He had not mentioned the subject again during the remainder of his life. He has since attempted to describe what he saw in the church on that day to me. There was a connection to World War II, and that is as much as I am able to reveal at this stage. During one of his many postal rounds, Grandfather witnessed a figure floating across the long driveway of a local stately home. He was able to state when any woman was pregnant way before she even suspected such, and that I know from experience. The most heartbreaking of all Grandfather's premonitions, however, concerned his youngest granddaughter, my sister. Long before it was evident she was so ill, Grandfather remarked sadly to Nana that there was something badly wrong with her. Again, he didn't elaborate why, what or how he knew. All I will say is that my sister's cancer diagnosis came as no shock or surprise to him. I feel strongly that Grandfather had foretold the circumstances of his own future passing, that he too was going to die from cancer. I feel it prudent to disclose that both of his parents died from lung cancer. Cancer had been a much feared illness with a degree of stigma attached to a diagnosis in years past. I remember this being the case as recently as the mid-1970s. It could be argued, and soundly so, that Grandfather was subconsciously traumatized from witnessing his parents' harrowing passings, and his own fear was based firmly upon those experiences and public perception of the disease. However, I also feel it prudent to mention that Great-Grandfather and Great-Granny were very heavy smokers. The lung cancers were almost certainly nicotine-induced. There was no indication that the cancer was genetic in nature. Although Grandfather smoked as a young man, he assured us this was very much a peer pressure issue, and he gave up, without hesitation, as soon as he took up boxing. He lived a healthy lifestyle and was a very fit man, having worked on the railways prior to becoming a postman. Grandfather had told Mum many years before his passing that if he was diagnosed with cancer, he didn't want to know. As far as I am aware, he only ever expressed this to Mum, and she always assured him that she wouldn't say a word if that transpired to be the case. Grandfather's words did turn out to be a chilling premonition. The time did arrive, and medical staff did indeed break the news to Mum that Grandfather was terminally ill with cancer only 2 days after his initial visit to the GP. Mum adhered to her earlier promise and never told Grandfather the truth of the severity of his condition. Grandfather has revealed to me that he had already known of his illness, though, and had known just how ill he was for a long, long time prior to his diagnosis. Grandfather was, and remains, a truly good man, deeply blessed with enormous courage, integrity, and honour. He was an angel walking on earth, and he continues to work hard for everyone on earth. He remains a protector for good, and is unafraid to voice his opinion, just as he had done during his 74 years on this planet.